Um, so after that major split, um, and it's still very much the Orthodox Church here was still headquartered out of Constantinople instead of popes. They had patriarchs. Still a very similar kind of function, but they kind of said, we're gonna. They didn't continue down the same path that you see the Roman Catholic Church going down here, which includes these crusades. The first crusade was in 1096. This was an attempt to reclaim Jerusalem from the Turks. Now, I mentioned it was in the mid 7th century that the Muslims began their conquest across Europe, and they had taken Jerusalem fairly early on. But at that time, they had allowed Christians to still come to Jerusalem and make these pilgrimages. And the Catholic Church at the time thought that was very valuable. In fact, that was one of the ways that they recognized as if you had committed a sin after you were baptized, one of the ways that you could get right was to make this pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Um, and so that there wasn't a huge deal with that for some time, as long as they were still allowed to make those pilgrimages. Um, but once the Turks, and they were still Muslims, but once the Turks took over, they no longer allowed those pilgrimages, and so that's I think what partially at least led to this need, if you will, to invade, militaristically there to reclaim Jerusalem. And once that first crusade occurred, and they were able to retake Jerusalem, it was just the first of many. I think there were maybe 8 total crusades. Um, I think the popes saw these as an opportunity to gain more power, um, and uh, and so you see this. So you can see how this is where we might have been on a gradual slope. Now things are really ticking up. We see things that are occurring that we can't possibly imagine the the church, founded by Jesus Christ would participate in. Where in Scripture do you read any kind of instruction that the church needs to control the government? I don't. You don't see. You see quite the opposite. Christ says, "Render to Caesar what is Caesar's." So the idea that they're crowning emperors is strange. Um, the idea that it's divided the way that it had is not something we read about in the New Testament. We read about unity, right? The fact that they are now um, going on these military crusades, is that something we read about in the New Testament? We read about quite the opposite. We read about a relatively pacifistic religion. We're told by Christ to turn the other cheek, if you will. And so these are all things that we look at these events that are occurring throughout this period, and we say, "Wow, what is going on here?" And then I think kind of culminating in the 13th century and running on for some time after that with inquisitions. All right, so this is where people, in the name of Christ, in the name of Christianity, would resort to torture, persecution, in order to either combat heresies. Right? Somebody's teaching a false doctrine, and so they will punish them, corporally. Right? They'll even to the point where they would burn people at the stake. They would do many of the same persecutions on people that they viewed as teaching the wrong things as what the Roman Empire had done to Christians in the first and second centuries. And if there was any question about whether or not this is the true church, I, this behavior certainly would suggest otherwise. It it ultimately became. I've got the 13th century there. There are a lot of different points throughout the mid 1200s that you could kind of point to, councils that made it appropriate for um, the civil government to carry out orders on behalf of the church, if you will. And so that's ultimately how it went down. It was civil punishments for religious disagreements, if you will. Um, Ultimately, if you've heard of the Spanish Inquisitions, this was much later than I've got here in the 1200s, and it's in the 1400s, I think, became extremely um, horrific. Um, and you see persecutions and executions um, taking place in the name of Christianity. So again, a broad, sweeping overview there to just highlight many of the results of the way things have really kind of gone off the rails. Pause there again for questions or comments. There are many other things that occurred during this period, certainly that I just wanted to kind of point out some highlights, and there are other major teachings and major scholars, many of which had some good things to say. I don't want to like completely say there was no value that